Oh, I already hit go live. I wonder, hopefully that doesn't. All right. Should be good. Perfect. All right, so we're in perhaps our last Bible study. If we make it to the end, then we will be done with Genesis. If not, then I will probably just, since next week's kind of Christmas week, maybe I'll just record a little Bible study for the last little bit and release that, send it out to everybody so we can get through that last little bit. But we're going to try and get through some serious text tonight. If we don't get through, and we still have quite a bit, then perhaps we'll just sort of finish Genesis up when we start another Bible study early in the spring. So we'll begin in prayer this last night. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Lord, we thank you for bringing us together this last time as we enter further into Advent, closer to this Christmas season. We beg your grace upon us, that you might be with us in all things, and that you might move our hearts to be the saints we're called to be through the study of your word. And we ask this all through Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, so we finished last week with Jacob and Esau about to come back together and sort of the wondering what's going to happen when they meet up again. And Jacob is quite afraid of what Esau is going to be like. You know, their last interaction was Esau saying, "I'm going to kill my brother Jacob," so he's not super optimistic about this reunion. And so he does something really strategic, which is actually pretty, I don't want to say sketchy. It's a little bit selfish, I guess you could say. But the Lord does something about it. So Jacob splits up all of his flocks into 3 different sort of waves, and he sends the first wave of his flocks out in front to meet Esau way ahead. And then, of course, he has sort of people who are letting him know how that meeting goes. And then he sends out a second wave to meet his brother Esau. And then he sends out a third wave to meet his brother Esau. And so the third wave has sort of intersected Esau, hit him with good... And when they get there, they're supposed to say, you know, when Esau says, "Where are you from?" they say, "We're from Jacob, your brother, and he wants to give you all of these things." So we're coming up on 32:22. So the flocks get there. All these flocks sent out ahead. All that's left with Jacob is his family, basically. And then he goes to bed that night and sort of prepares to meet Esau in the morning. And it's that night that he wrestles the angel. So we spoke a little bit about him wrestling the angel last time, that he's wrestling this angel, and the angel's basically sort of waking him up to who he's supposed to be. Not this sort of grasping, selfish, clever, manipulative person, but truly the father of Israel. And so, the wrestling with the angel and refusing to let this angel go before he gives him his blessing is the thing that sort of definitively changes Jacob. So the day before, he sends out these flocks ahead of him to meet his brother, and basically, just in case Esau is angry and starts slaughtering his servants and his flocks, you know, he could have figured it out way ahead of time and gotten out of there, so he didn't have to meet with Esau. Then, after the wrestling with the angel, Jacob changes. So what he does when he finally meets him, he looks up and he sees Esau out in the distance, and instead of sending out his family ahead of him, he lines his family up behind him, comes to meet Esau, and sort of bows down, asking for his blessing and his forgiveness, and sort of shields his family. So it's a definitively different act. So this time he's in front of his family, sort of being the one who is, in a sense, willing to die for them, instead of sending them out ahead of him to die and sort of give him the warning. And then this really, really interesting thing happens. So Esau asks, what was all this supposed to mean? And then Jacob says, please take all these things. I beg you to sort of receive these gifts that I've given you. Esau says, no, you don't have to give me anything. I'm doing fine for myself. And then he says in verse 10 of chapter 33, he says this, no, I pray you, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. With such favor have you received me. Accept, I pray you, my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. Thus he urged him, and he took it. So what does this mean? Like, when I see you, your face is like the face of God. Well, Jacob literally just wrestled with God. He literally just said, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved, in chapter 22. And now he sees his brother, and he realizes that the angel whom he wrestled actually took on the face of his brother. So that when Jacob wrestles this angel, he's wrestling both sort of with God, with the sort of mission that he has from God, but also with the sort of what God is telling him is that in a sense you cannot serve God and hate your family. It's like John. You can't hate your brother and sister and love God. If you hate your brother, you can't love God. So how is he supposed to live out his mission with God if he doesn't reconcile with his brother? So in a sense, he was sort of wrestling ahead of time with his brother. So that's a really interesting thing that he's realizing as he sees his brother. And then he does both the right thing and the clever thing, which is to force all of this stuff upon his brother. So Esau has forgiven him, but we all know that human forgiveness is a sort of weak and fickle thing. So Esau forgives him, but he forces this sort of material reconciliation anyways. So if you ever cheated someone at any point in your life, and then you meet them again later and you're expecting them to hate you, but they actually turns out that they've sort of reconciled that in their heart, if you're still capable of restoring the thing that you cheated them out of or whatever, I would still suggest doing that, because that sort of guarantees the future of that forgiveness. And so Jacob is sort of guaranteeing the future of his brother's forgiveness by sort of restoring to him the birthright that he lost, that he stole from him. So Jacob's obviously changed. He's become a different man in a fairly definitive way, but we realize at the same time that, as is always the case, even as we change, the things that we've done in the past have repercussions in the world that we both can't predict and generally sort of line up with the person we were in the past. So it's like, even though I've changed, the things I did in the past can still sort of come home to roost in the world. And Jacob realizes that as he begins to sort of raise his family. So we're really moving, in chapter 34 of Genesis, we're moving from the story of Jacob on to the story of Jacob's sons and daughter in 34 in particular. So we're moving in now to the next generation, the story of the next generation, which is the generation that becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's just as complicated, perhaps more complicated, than the previous stories and not by any means sort of this bright and glorious thing. It is at times, but in particular, this chapter 34 story that starts is not. But there's a great lesson to be learned in this story. So Dinah, this is sort of the story about Dinah. And I don't know, this isn't really one of the stories in Genesis that's very sort of famous, and you'll see why as we read it. But it's a really interesting story nonetheless. So Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land, and when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and laid with her and humbled her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the maiden and spoke tenderly to her, so Shechem spoke to his daughter, or his father, Hamor, saying, "Get me this maiden for my wife." So, not a very good thing has happened. Dinah was basically sort of like raped/seduced by Shechem, and then he sort of fell in love with her after, or whatever that means, and then asks, and then he wants to marry her. Now you can guess that when Jacob hears about that, he's not very happy about the situation. This pagan, not one of the people of Israel, has forced himself on his daughter and now wants to marry her. And so he's angry, wondering what to do, and then Dinah's brothers, Levi and Simeon, are even less happy about the situation. And so they scheme something up in the spirit of their father Jacob, who has become a much more practical man, but they are not practical men. So Simeon and Levi go and they sort of come up with a scheme. They tell all the men of this whole town that they will start trading with them and give them their daughters if they all get circumcised. And this is a pretty appealing thing to the men of this town. Who knows how rich they were, but Jacob was definitely rich. This guy had huge amounts of flocks and land and money, and they're a pretty prosperous, large family in this little region, which, in the history of the world isn't very rich. So they were doing pretty well compared to those around them. And it's not that you shouldn't feel sorry for Shechem in this story necessarily, because he goes back and basically says to the men of the town, he says, "Will not their cattle, their property, and all their beasts be ours, if only we agree to do this?" So he convinces the people of the town. They all think it's a pretty good idea. They all go and get circumcised. And then in verse 25 of chapter 34, on the third day when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, so Abraham, it's kind of a repeat of the Abraham story. He's sitting there outside of his tent, just been circumcised. Now these guys feel the same. It's not a very happy day. They're pretty sore. Simeon and Levi and all of their buddies go in and kill everyone. Slaughter the whole town, all the men, and then take all their stuff and all of the women with them. So you can see here that there's a really interesting thing at work here. When we think of, I kind of spoke to it before, it's the Godfather principle, still in effect. Did I tell everyone about that? Yeah. So the idea of an eye for an eye, which we see in today's world, everyone's like, oh, eye for an eye, and the whole world's blind, which is true, and I guess, but it was so foreign to people in this time, and I would say people in nature, to even want to revenge themselves in an equal way, that was a huge leap forward. It was a sort of moment of enlightenment in human history for us to limit our vengeance to equal parts. Because you see here, their sister is seduced or taken advantage of by a man, and they kill the whole village as in revenge, and enslave all of their women and children. and take all of their, they wipe them off the face of the earth. And then, why is Jacob terrified afterwards? Well, because these guys in this village have relatives down the road, and they're probably on their way right now to wipe Jacob and all of his sons and their whole tribe off the face of the earth. So that's how natural man, natural people operate. So when we think about an eye for an eye, we're like, I can't believe God commanded something like that. Well, God commanded that because it was such an incredibly huge leap forward that we never could have actually come to that on our own. If Jesus came along in this time and said, turn the other cheek, it would have been incomprehensible to people. They would have probably killed him just for saying it. You just don't say something like that in the ancient world. It was such a sort of primitive law. So the Lord builds the law step by step. He sort of walks us step by step toward perfection. And at this point in history, they don't even have the law at all. So we get just in this next chapter, though, we get a little bit of a harbinger of the law, which is interesting. But I want to raise a question just prior to this, sort of like I don't know if anyone needs to answer it necessarily right now, but we have this sort of crazy righteous anger of Simeon and Levi. And then you have this sort of practical, pragmatic approach of Jacob. Jacob was going to basically ignore the problem and make a deal with these guys because there's a chance we're going to get wiped off the earth if we don't. Simeon and Levi want to take this crazy vengeance, but in a sense, they want justice because the last thing they want is for their sister to be wed to the man who just forced himself on her. I mean, just imagine someone like that, something like that in today's world, actually happening. I mean, there's no way. There's no way. So these guys don't want it to happen. Which one was right? Would Jacob have been right? Just like, hey guys, don't push your luck. Or is Simeon and Levi, is their sort of righteous anger more in the right in taking vengeance on these people for what they did to their sister? Because it's a difficult thing. You can't go to the cops in the ancient world. It's like you either are the cops or there are no cops. It's the Wild West in a true sense, the Wild East, I guess. But there is no other way of handling the situation except to handle it yourself. So it's an interesting situation. It's easy for us to condemn. It's like, oh, they committed genocide. It's like, well, it's not like you go in to that village and just take down Shechem and expect everyone else to sit around. It's like Shechem's the leader of the village. So you can't punish him for what he did. There's no other option. So it's an interesting situation. I'm not justifying what they did, just saying that in the ancient world, we think of them as completely different people from ourselves, unrelatable. But what would our desires for vengeance have been given the same situation? They don't have the law. They don't have anything yet. Okay, so we go to chapter 35. God tells Jacob, arise, go to Bethel, dwell there, and make an altar to God. And the next thing he tells him to do, so this is sort of the beginning of God revealing himself as the one true God. He says, put away your foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves, change your garments. So in a sense, put away all these false gods, consecrate yourself to me. That's what he's telling him to do. And so they go to Bethel. They do this. Actually, the place is called Shechem, not to be confused with the Shechem who wanted to marry Dinah. Different things. It's a place, not unrelated to him as a person. So he builds this altar, and Shechem, slash Bethel, becomes sort of one of the first sort of consecrated places of worship in Israel. And we see a little bit down the road in Joshua. So Joshua 24, see if I can just flip there real quick. We hear about this place again. What happens in Joshua 24 is that Joshua, as he's preparing the people, so I'll just read a little bit of Joshua 24. Joshua gathers all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, summons the elders, the heads, the judges of the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And then he tells them the story of Israel, the story basically that we're studying. Your fathers lived of old beyond the Euphrates, Terah, their father Abraham, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river. So that he begins there, tells the whole story, and then he finishes with, in verse 23, put away the foreign gods which are among you, and incline your head to the Lord, the God of Israel. And then he does the same thing that Jacob is doing right now. He builds a pillar at Shechem and sort of reconsecrates the place to the Lord. So this is this is the beginning of, you could say, Israel proper. We finally got a force. It's not just Abraham wandering around wondering when God's going to fulfill his promise. We've got a people. And to sort of show that in verse 36, or chapter 36, we get this massive sort of just list of names of all these people. So we're going to skip over that in thinking about time, and we're going to jump in to the story of Joseph. Well, the story of all the brothers, but it sort of centers around Joseph, who's an incredibly fascinating character. I mean, Joseph is, in many ways, say in the Old Testament, one of the key sort of Christ figures, one of the key prefigurers of Christ in the Old Testament. But he doesn't start that way. No saints, you could say, start as saints. But it starts, as always, in the Scriptures, with a sibling rivalry. It says right away that Joseph was his father's favorite. And we can see it's sort of bringing you back just one generation to, well, two generations, I guess, to Isaac and Rebekah. As you remember, Isaac's favorite was Esau, Rebekah's favorite was Jacob, and it didn't work out very well. You know, whenever parents, I don't know if you have your favorites, you might have your favorites, but when you sort of are obvious about your favorites, or you treat your favorite child differently from the rest of the children in a noticeable way, then that tends to just not work out for the siblings. So we see again here that it doesn't work out for anyone. Well, it actually does, but only because of God, not because of them. Okay. So actually, that's one of the best parts of the story, in many ways, that God literally sort of takes the sins of these people, of these brothers, and uses them to save them. So that's one of the many sort of beautiful salvation stories in the midst of this. Okay, so it starts with Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a lad with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. Joseph brought an ill report of them to his father. So he's a snitch. All right, so that's the first thing about Joseph we need to know. He's a snitch. And Israel loved him more than any of his other children. So Jacob, whose name is now Israel, is the father. He who wrestles with God is what Israel means. He got that name after wrestling with God. He loves Joseph more than anyone else, first because he tells him when his other sons are slacking, but also because he's the son of his old age, and because he's Rachel's son, and he loved Rachel more than any of his other wives. So, multiple things going on here. And so my translation says that he made him a long robe with sleeves. Sometimes you get this sort of many-colored robe, depending on the translation. Anyways, he made him a special, sort of extra dignified robe that's sort of a status of office. And so if you've got 12 brothers, 11 brothers, and your youngest brother gets this sort of robe that basically tells you that he's the one who's going to inherit everything, and he's snitching on you, then you're just not going to like him at all. I mean, it literally says they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Rightly so, you know. Then, not only that, so Joseph has a dream, and then he tells it to his brothers, and they hated him the more. He says, "Hear this dream, which I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." So he tells them he has a dream that they all serve him. And then he has another dream. Same thing. You know, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." Which is, not only his brothers are going to bow down to him, but his parents are going to bow down to him. So it's not necessarily clear that Joseph actually, he doesn't know, it's not clear that he knows here that he received these dreams from God. You know, he just had dreams and tells his siblings, which basically means he's a cocky little kid. He's like, "I have dreams about all kinds of crazy stuff. It doesn't mean it's going to come true, and I'm definitely not going to tell anybody about it." You know, so he's a snitch, and he's arrogant, and he knows full well that his dad loves him more than all of his brothers. And it takes a lot for him to go from being this kid, this 17-year-old kid, to what he becomes. And what that includes is basically a tremendous amount of suffering. So, we get to verse 12 here. His brothers are pasturing their flock at Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I'll send you to them. And Joseph says, "Here I am." So basically, his dad says, "Hey, I'm going to send you out. Take a look at what your brothers are doing. If they're slacking, come and tell me." So he's sending them out to snitch on them again. And so he says, "Okay, yep, I'm on my way." So he goes out and makes his way out there, and he finds out that they're not at Shechem. They're at Dothan. So he's basically going to figure out what they're doing so he can go back and tell Dad that they're not doing what they should be doing. And as he's coming up, we already see the sort of beginning of a bad thing. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer." It's a great name. "So come now, let us kill him, throw him into a pit, and we shall say a wild beast has devoured him." So they're plotting their brother's death. As we could see through all of these stories, that barely a generation goes by where a brother doesn't want to or try to kill his brother. So if anyone ever tells you that scriptures are like the opiate of the masses, and that they're just like these things that all they do is sort of tell us beautiful, peaceful stories to make us relax and be oppressed by the government, it's the dumbest thing ever. It doesn't make any sense at all. The scripture stories are real, and they're raw, and they're not at all anything to do with sort of making us lay back and be oppressed. If anything, they sort of bring about crazy rebellions against authority, because that's pretty much what all these stories are. Okay, so they're plotting his death, but all of these brothers have like subplots within the plot. So Reuben, who's just not in a great place with his dad, obviously, but he's the oldest, and wants to sort of, he's got to prove himself because Joseph is the one that his dad loves the most. And so in the hopes of winning back his father's love, he's going to let these guys throw Joseph in a pit and then come and grab him later. Doesn't work out for him, though. Because after they throw him down in the pit, they get this idea that they should just actually not kill him themselves, but sell him into slavery. So they sell him into slavery. I mean, we all kind of know the basics of the story. They sell him to a bunch of Ishmaelites. Now, if we look at what the Ishmaelites were carrying, this is a really interesting part. So, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh. So these Ishmaelites were carrying sort of the balm and the myrrh, so the frankincense and the myrrh are sort of two of the three things that were given to Christ in the nativity. And so you kind of see the beginning of this imagery. So they sell them to them for how much? 20 shekels, which is, if you think about sort of then until the time of Christ, they sell him for 20 shekels. How much does Judas sell Christ for? 30 shekels. It's almost like it's basically the same price plus inflation. So it's a sort of comparable thing. So Reuben comes back, and you're like, how did Reuben not know any of this happened? Well, Reuben's the oldest, so he's actually the only one out watching the flocks while all this develops. So he comes back to save Joseph, and he's gone. So he misses the opportunity, his plot doesn't work out, and Joseph's sold into slavery. And they come back, and Dad's distraught. He doesn't know what to do about it. And Joseph is sold to Potiphar, who is the captain of the guard. Now, in many ways, we see through all of this that Joseph has to experience these things in order to sort of be transformed. And it's a really interesting way to think about the sort of suffering that we experience in our lives. To think about it not as things that are happening to us, not that God's sort of like letting us suffer, but that He's allowing these things to happen for the sake of our salvation. Because Joseph's life is basically a series of tragedies. But the Lord is with him in the midst of the whole thing. So he's sold into this house. God's with him, so everything prospers under his hands. He's a smart kid. He knows his stuff. He's rises through the ranks until he becomes the head of Potiphar's house. But he's also a young, probably, I don't know, must be a good-looking guy. So Potiphar's wife gets interested and tries to seduce him. He won't do it. She keeps trying. He wants nothing to do with it. And then she grabs him by the shirt one day and says, basically, it's decision time for him. And instead of, and this is a sort of interesting spiritual principle as well, when a temptation comes, you don't negotiate. That's not the way to approach temptation. So say you're, whether it's temptation in the flesh, like Joseph's facing here, or a temptation toward anger or judgment, any of those things come, anything that has to do with the passions, like strong feelings, you don't negotiate with that. You don't say, you don't like try to wiggle your way around it. You just run. And that's what Joseph did. He runs. But unfortunately, he leaves his garment behind for the second time. So the first time Joseph gets thrown into his pit. In the pit, his dad thinks he's dead because they've got his coat, his dream coat, whatever you want to call it. And then the second time, he runs away from Potiphar, but she keeps the garment behind and uses it as evidence against him and gets him thrown in prison. So he's not a very lucky guy when it comes to his garments. But he gets thrown in prison because once he sort of spurns her approach, she yells out saying that he was trying to, that he was doing to her what she was trying to do to him. He was trying to seduce her. And then he ends up in prison. So as we know, he's a dreamer, and before he was sort of using his dreams, to bring sort of anxiety and misery to the life of his brothers, but now the interpretation of these dreams that he starts to, that the Lord sort of uses for his sake, actually become the salvation of many people. I guess in a worldly sense, sort of there. We'll see. So he's in jail, and these the baker and butler are sent to jail, and he's like, "What's going on, guys? What's wrong?" So we're at chapter 40 here. Why are your faces downcast? God knows how to interpret dreams, and I know God, so let's figure out what the dreams mean. So these two guys tell him about their dreams, and it says it's not necessarily good news. He just tells them what the dreams mean. It's good news for one, and it's not for the other. So he basically tells the baker, I think he tells the baker, I just get these two mixed up. It's the butler and the baker. So he tells the butler, or he tells the baker that he's going to get his head cut off, and he tells the butler that he's going to be restored to his office. And it comes true. So it's not necessarily the best news for the old baker, but the butler, unfortunately, as he's leaving, Joseph says, remember that I was the one who told you that. Tell Pharaoh that I'm the one who knows how to do these things. And of course, in the excitement of being free from jail and restored to his office, he totally forgets about Joseph, and he's stuck in jail for a little bit longer. But then, suddenly, finally, when the Pharaoh has a dream and no one can interpret it, the butler's like, "Oh man, there's a guy in your prison that can interpret dreams." So he finally remembers Joseph and brings him to Pharaoh. And there's a really interesting sort of interaction between Joseph and Pharaoh. So Pharaoh basically says, "Joseph, I hear you can interpret dreams." And Joseph says, "No, God interprets dreams, but I just happen to know God. So God will give you the interpretation of your dream." And then so he tells him about this crazy image of sort of the multiple different dreams that he has about the seven sort of fat cows, and then the seven skinny cows eating the seven fat cows, and then it's kind of the same image over and over again. So the seven prosperous, 7 lean years. And then Joseph says a really interesting thing to Pharaoh, and this is sort of brings us forward in many ways to the Exodus, and then also just brings us forward. It just sort of reveals very early on true monotheism. And what it says is, in verse 28 of chapter 41, "It is as I told Pharaoh, that God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land, but after there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. Famine will consume the land." So what he's saying is, Pharaoh, I happen to know you're just a normal dude. You're not God. Because I know God, and you're not him. So this is what God's about to do, and you better listen to him. And Pharaoh is he's literally in Egypt, the son of Ra, the son of the sun god. That's the tradition. And so Joseph is telling him basically that he's not God. And this Pharaoh, to his credit, realizes that he's got someone who actually knows what he's talking about here, and listens to Joseph's advice to store up tons of grain in order that they can make it through the lean years. And then for the third time, he gets his garment. So in verse 42, Pharaoh took a signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck, and made him ride in his second chariot. So he makes him effectively the prime minister of Egypt. Pharaoh knows, that he doesn't really know what he's talking about. He's just from the ruling family. And Joseph happens to know what he's talking about, so he makes him these garments of fine linen, which, if you remember, when Christ is stripped of his clothing before the crucifixion, he's wearing a seamless linen garment that they actually don't even split up when they cast lots for it instead, because it's seamless, and so therefore it's worth a tremendous amount of money. It's a very fine garment. So Joseph receives that here. Sort of receives the ring, the signet ring, and the linen garment. So we sort of, as Joseph's story is happening, we come back to Jacob and his sons that he has left. We've hit the 7 years of famine that have spread throughout the land, and Jacob, who's obviously not in a very good mood because he lost his favorite son, says, "Why do you look at one another? There's grain in Egypt. Go down and get some grain for us that we might not die." But he didn't send Benjamin with him. Why didn't he send Benjamin with him? Well, because Benjamin's his only sort of favorite son that he has left. Rachel's other son that they have after Joseph leaves. And it shows pretty clearly that they don't actually believe the story that the sons told them. They came back with this garment and they said, "Oh, this crazy wild beast ate Joseph." Does Jacob believe that? Well, perhaps a crazy wild beast did eat Joseph, but I'm very well aware that all of you hated Joseph, and I don't necessarily trust your story. So I'm not going to send my new favorite son with you to Egypt. But Joseph sees his brothers coming, and sort of, he's dressed as an Egyptian. They're not going to know who he is. Shaved head, probably crazy Egyptian hat. I'm sure there's a name for that hat, but I don't know what it is. So he's the second in control. They just can't imagine that they're brothers in this role. They think he's dead, or he's a slave somewhere. So they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And he disguises himself and basically accuses them of lying about, how many people are in their family or what's going on. He's asking them all these pointed questions, and they're wondering what's going on. And he convinces them to leave Simeon behind to sort of prove that they're not lying to him. And then what he does is he fills all their money sacks with money. So he keeps Simeon and puts a bunch of money in their bags without them knowing. And then they go home to Jacob, and when they bring all the grain out, there's all this money in there. So they happen to have a lot of money, and they're missing one of their brothers. So basically, he frames them for doing the thing that they actually did to him. He makes it seem like they sold Simeon. And in needing to bring back Benjamin, so he tells them they can't have Simeon back unless they bring back Benjamin. He makes it look like they want to also sell Benjamin. So Jacob's not very happy about this whole deal. No, he's not very pumped, but he doesn't really have any choice. Reuben is sort of long gone by now. Levi and Simeon, not long gone, but like long gone from being the favorite. Levi and Simeon sort of lost their shot at being the leader of the family when they committed genocide. And so Judah, who's sort of the fourth son down the line, finally steps up and says, if something happens to Benjamin, it's on my life. So he sort of offers himself as the sacrificial son to his father, which is the only thing that sort of makes it possible that Jacob's going to go along with anything. And then they come back, and Joseph tests them again. He basically just says the same, in many ways, the same thing to him that he said to him last time, which is like, well, I need to keep Benjamin while you guys go back, because I don't trust you. And then Judah finally steps up and says, hey, if you do this, our father will die. We don't want our father to die. So take me instead of Benjamin. And then Joseph finally sort of breaks down. He realizes that they've changed enough, that's finally they sort of realize what's happened, what they've done, in a sense repented of it, and he reveals himself to them, and the family is brought back together in many ways. And as a result of that, they sort of bring the whole of their family to Egypt, which is a fascinating thing. So the Israel moving to Egypt was actually, in the beginning, a good thing, and you could say very clearly the will of God for the survival of Israel, for the family, not just Israel as a person who's still alive right now. But they move the whole family there, and they actually grow and are on friendly terms with the Pharaoh and the second in command, who's their brother. And it's not until much later, as we see, in the first line of Exodus, chapter 8, or verse 8, chapter 1. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So down the line we run into problems because get along a couple generations along, and this family sort of inhabiting their land, and they've sort of forgotten why they let this family inhabit their land. So multiple generations have passed, and they start to see them as a threat because they're fruitful and they're multiplying. But at least in the beginning, they were welcomed into Egypt, and they were actually sort of prosperous and helpful part. So at the end of his life, Israel, Jacob/Israel, is giving blessings to his sons. And in many ways, the blessings that he gives are not good blessings. But one of them matters for us in particular. And that's the blessing of Judah. So as we know, Judah was the one who offered himself in place of Benjamin as the sort of sacrificial brother. He's the one who finally stepped up and did something selfless for his brother and sort of won the freedom and prosperity of their family by doing so. He's the one who inherits the kingship. So the future kingship of Israel at this moment, this is chapter 49, verse 8, is the blessing of Judah. And it's through Judah that the kings of Israel will come, and then also through the line of Judah that the Messiah will come, the Messiah, the King of Israel. And so it's through Judah's line that Jesus comes. Interestingly, Judah, not Joseph. So Judah's the one who did that and therefore received the kingship. So this is the blessing. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Judah, a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion, and as a lioness who dares rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So an interesting... and then the final lines. Binding his fowl to the vine, and his ass's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine, and his teeth white with milk. So a lot of imagery there that sort of Christ takes up in a very concrete way. And so the binding his foal to the vine and his ass's colt to the choice vine, in many ways, so from that, other prophecies come that clarify many of these things. So like Israel, your ruler shall come to you on a colt, the foal of an ass. So in the ruler of Israel, the final king of Israel, comes in, on the humblest of steeds, as Christ comes in on Palm Sunday. He's riding a donkey. And so there's many images we could go into that we don't have time to do, but it's through Judah that the line continues. Actually, not even through the tribes don't even come through Joseph; they come through his sons. Who are Manasseh and I can't believe I just forgot the other one. It's embarrassing. Ephraim. Ephraim and Manasseh are the ones who take Joseph's place in the 12 tribes. So we made it kind of, we had to kind of fly through those last few chapters. But the life of Joseph, as we finish up, there's one line I just want to go back to as a sort of spiritual principle for us to move forward with, that in the midst of all of Joseph's struggles, there's this great line that comes up in chapter 39, verse 21. So he's in prison. He's just been framed for doing what is right. And it says, "But the Lord was with him and showed him steadfast love." I think that's sort of the thing we can always trust in, especially when we're persecuted for doing what is right. And as Christians, Christ promised us that's always what was going to happen. We are always going to be persecuted for doing what was right. If we're persecuted for doing what was wrong, great, we deserve it. But for doing what was right, that's when the Christian sort of embraces that. Because we know that the Lord is always with us, showing us steadfast love, and that he's always going to take whatever that persecution that we received and work some incredible, sort of unimaginable good out of it, as he did with Joseph. It's only because of all the things that Joseph experienced that he brought about not only the salvation of his family, so the life of his family, but of all of Egypt. He actually fed an entire people through Joseph for 7 years of famine. So it's incredible. We don't know the crazy ways in which God's going to use those things, and we can always trust that he will. So it's always worth doing what's right, even if it actually seems like it's going to work out better to compromise in some significant way. So that's all I got for today. We kind of burned through it, made it to the end, and in the spring we'll hopefully move into Exodus. It's just as fascinating of a story. Anyone have any questions? No, none from the feed. Any? No one here? What's that?
Do you have a list of, I guess I'm kind of troubled by what we were talking about with creation. I guess I
Sure.
view creation the way the Bible explained it. I have a hard time thinking of us being here for billions of years. I think it's a number of millions of billions so I don't know if there's anything that you have. I guess I don't know. To me, it seems like God created Dinah, but somewhat what you were saying, where did he come from? If we can't believe what the story of creation is, I know it's still with, imagery but then what do we believe?
Yeah, so the question was back all the way back to creation. If God didn't create us just as the scriptures say that He did, is it not a step back? Are we not making a significant compromise in saying that God created us, but He didn't necessarily have to create us in the way that the scriptures say that He did? Benedict actually writes, he preached a few homilies that are put together in this little volume called In the Beginning. He talks about kind of the same thing. Is it not the case, if we seem to be compromising this story, who's to say that we aren't going to end up compromising, the incarnation someday, or these things? But it's actually one of the important things, and I talked a little bit about this, but maybe not as much as I should have, is to, when we talk about the incarnation or the crucifixion or the resurrection, what are those stories trying to say? So what's the goal of the author in those stories? It's actually to say that Christ, in a particular moment in time, became a man. That's actually why they cite who was ruling at the time in Israel. What was the town where this happened? Who experienced it? Who witnessed it? Like, what was the exact year? It's all the way down to the year of Herod's rule in which this happened. Christ was born. And actually, sort of through the particular astronomical events happening, we narrow it down to the day in which He was born. So they're actually making a historical point. And same with so many of the moments of Christ's life, that it's not, the New Testament is not written as a sort of, it is theological, but it's also specifically historical, which is actually unique to Christianity. We actually care about the moment in history in which certain things happened. Now, if we look at Genesis, that's actually not how the story of creation was written. It doesn't say, at this moment in history, God did this, created the world in this time, and it's exactly this many years ago. Now, fundamentalist Christians have sort of cited, they're like, oh, well, if we count all the years through this time, then it adds up to what? I think this is 7,000 or something. But the problem with that is none of the stories in those first 11 chapters that we talked about make citations to time. In fact, when we look at, Cain and Abel, as Cain goes out into the world, suddenly we realize that there's all these other people around. It's like, what the heck? Aren't they the only two people around? Well, it's not making a historical point. So it's not, the claims aren't the same in the New Testament as they are in Genesis. Later on in Genesis, when it comes to Abraham, those stories start to legitimately be chronological, and that's when we start to see real history play itself out. But what is Genesis trying to say? Like, what are the main points that we can never nor will ever compromise? That God gave human beings a soul. So how our bodies came about? Well, over the course of, this is where science speaks into this, because it's not making a scientific point in Genesis. How exactly our bodies came about. Are we material from the earth? Yes. In what sort of exact method were they brought about? I put forward sort of my theory in the talk on evolution, but evolution's still a theory. We actually don't know exactly how it's going to move forward, what exactly that looks like. We have archaeological evidence that's pretty good. We have we're starting to sort of get a grasp on genetics, but all the same, we don't know exactly, we don't know the details. But we did not evolve a soul. God gave us our soul. So He made our body, sort of in whatever fashion He made it, whether or not that was in a single day or over the course of millions of years of evolution. But our soul was given to us in a moment, and it was given to one or two human beings. So one or two people. It wasn't like a whole sort of group of people arose. He gave it to one, Adam, and then Eve. And we all descend from those two. That's what Genesis is saying. We have to have descended from this pair. And actually, we know now that we all descended from one or two people. Well, two. It had to be two, because you have to have a mom and a dad. So, we know now that that's actually true. So what Genesis claimed is true in that sense. Now it's tough. It's a tough sort of like realization, or not even necessarily, it's a challenge to not be able to, you could say literally, as we think of literally, believe every word of the Scriptures. But as Thomas Aquinas said very clearly, that to believe the Scriptures literally is to believe the story, like to believe what the author intended to tell us. So I think it's a simplistic way to read Scriptures, to read it all as we read sort of textbooks today. We know that that's just not as the authors were writing. That's just not the way that every story is meant to be read. So I wasn't putting forth in that like a infallible statement, because that was a lot of speculative sort of reading in, because we don't know scientifically exactly how things happen. But we do know that that our faith can't contradict truth, and therefore if the truth seems to suggest or makes absolutely clear that the world is 4.5 billion years old, then the world can't be 6,000 years old. And that seems, and then that's absolutely clear. And then if our bodies, if there's archaeological evidence that our bodies evolved over 2.5 million years or something like that, then that's probably what happened. But there's no evidence that our souls evolved, because there can't be, because it didn't happen. They were given to us by God. So I don't think we have to compromise anything. I do think we have to. I think we have a lot to learn and dig in, but I don't see it as a compromise at all of the Scriptures. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer, but it's 7:06. There's a ton of literature about this. All kinds of people are getting into that exact question. So I think in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see a lot of really good scholarship come out in that area, and hopefully people won't have to watch my talk anymore and listen to that rookie stuff. All right, we'll say glory be in color. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Yeah, see ya.